We're talking about bacteria and prokaryotes primarily. And I wanted to spend just a minute talking about some of the beneficial roles that bacteria can play. So these would be not only environmental, but also in terms of human health. We're kind of conditioned to think of bacteria as bad and harmful, and of course there are some that are, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But they also have some very important roles, not only on planet Earth, but in terms of our own good health. So we do find bacteria in all ecosystems. I mentioned that already. No matter where you look, you're going to find bacteria. And really only a very small percentage of bacteria are human pathogens, meaning they cause disease. There's all kinds of useful things that man has been able to do with bacteria. So all kinds of food applications, making cheeses, sourdough bread, for example, yogurt. We use bacteria to treat sewage. We actually produce a lot of antibiotics from bacteria, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but um, bacteria will produce antibiotics to kill other bacteria, right? Basically, a form of bacterial warfare. We can isolate vitamins and other important chemicals from bacteria. So um, they do have a lot of sort of biotechnology type applications. Um, and then just in terms of the environment, um, bacteria play a number of key roles. So one is in terms of plant growth and even growth of some important crops. Um, a lot of plants will have difficulty um, taking up, accessing nitrogen in the soil. So, nitrogen is one of those key elements that plants need for growth. If you ever put fertilizer out, it's usually typically phosphorus and nitrogen based fertilizers. But as I said, they have difficulty accessing nitrogen in the soil without the help of what we call nitrogen fixing bacteria. So these are bacteria growing either in the soil or on the roots of the plant that can convert nitrogen into ammonia, which is a chemical form of nitrogen the plants can access and use. So just to give you one example, we grow a lot of soybeans here in Kansas, and if you were to go to a soybean field and pull up one of the plants, you would see the root system look something like this, where you have what appears to be these little tumors all over the roots. And those tumors are actually what are called nodules, and those nodules are structures that the plant makes to allow for this symbiotic growth of these nitrogen fixing bacteria. If you cut one of these nodules in half, it's basically packed full of nitrogen fixing bacteria that are, again, pulling that nitrogen out of the soil, converting it to ammonia, and then allowing the plant to access that ammonia and aid in its growth. And in return, the bacteria is getting some nutrients from the plant in this nice protected place to live. The other really key environmental role that prokaryotes are playing are as decomposers, right? So breaking down dead material. And, this is really critical for recycling of elements and things like carbon dioxide. So, a lot of this elemental cycling of things like nitrogen and sulfur would stop without the aid of prokaryotes, and really the ecosystems would shut down. So it's hard to overstate their importance in the world. And another critical role that bacteria played um, that we don't often think about is if all the evidence suggests the environment of ancient Earth was very different than today, very inhospitable place for multicellular life. And then along came the cyanobacteria, these photosynthetic bacteria living in oceans that started pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and producing oxygen gas as a byproduct of their photosynthesis. Um, all the data suggests these cyanobacteria dramatically changed the environment of planet Earth and really created the atmosphere that we know and love today. And it was the production of that atmosphere due to these photosynthetic bacteria that then allowed the evolution of multicellular eukaryotic life, such as ourselves. So, we've got the cyanobacteria to thank for our presence here on planet Earth today. Um, in terms of human health, as I mentioned, we usually tend to think of bacteria as a bad thing, and certainly they can be. But we find bacteria living on and, in fact, in our own bodies, and really bodies of all animals for that matter. Um, so, for example, cattle, um, cows can eat grass, right? And really, the reason they can do that is they have bacteria in their gut that produce enzymes called cellulases that can digest cellulose. So just on their own, the cows are not biologically capable of producing that enzyme. Um, and so there's been this big push in the last, I would say, 10 years in biology looking at what are called microbiomes. You may have heard that term before. But microbiome basically refers to the bacterial communities that live on or in human bodies. And we don't like to think about this, but every surface of our bodies are covered with lots and lots of bacteria. In fact, hundreds of bacteria, different strains. So just to give you a few examples, you're probably aware of the fact that you have lots of bacteria growing in your intestinal tract. Some of those bacteria are producing key vitamins that we need for our own survival. You may have heard about the term biofilms. So these are films of bacteria that line certain parts of our body, including our intestines, and those biofilms are really key for uptake of nutrients from our diet. So if your intestinal flora is disrupted by taking a strong antibiotic, right, that can really have some significant health consequences. You'll feel very, very poorly, and your body's just not functioning well until you're able to replenish those bacterial populations. But it's not just in our gut, as I alluded to. You find bacteria basically everywhere on and in your body. And the more we've looked into these microbiomes, researchers have realized that um, lots, maybe even all human disease has some link to um, the structure of our microbiome. So, what bacterial species we have in different parts of our body can really dramatically affect our normal functioning, or could be linked to certain diseases or disorders. So we're still just trying to begin to understand this, but there have been lots and lots of diseases that have been linked to changes or disruptions in microbiomes. And just to give you one, current example, we're going to talk about viruses here in a minute. But as I'm recording this, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a research article that just came out of China last week, showing that at least in the Chinese cases, there seemed to be a link between gut microbiome communities and risk of dying from COVID-19. So people, with certain gut microbiomes seem to be at less risk than others. Um, so again, it just illustrates the fact that most diseases, or our risk of fatality due to certain diseases, may be tied into our particular microbiomes. And so, a lot of what we know about microbiomes just comes from tissue sampling and then genome sequencing of bacteria. So, pretty much no matter where you look on or in the body, you're going to find hundreds of different species of bacteria. And there's lots of ongoing studies trying to see, okay, well, how do those species differ, tissue to tissue, person to person? And then how do those different communities link to human health or human disease? And I think, in another 10, 20 years, we may have a much better picture and may actually be able to treat or reduce risk of certain diseases by intentionally altering our microbiomes. So there are some definite environmental and human health benefits to bacteria, but of course bacteria can also cause serious disease and death. And usually the bad consequences of bacterial infection are due to two factors. One is invasiveness, or the other is toxigenicity. So a very invasive pathogen would be one that could multiply, basically reproduce very well inside a host. And toxigenicity would be the bacteria is actually producing toxins that may damage tissues or cells. And so either one of those on their own or both together could obviously be problems. The invasiveness is really an issue just because if the bacteria is dividing so well inside of its host, it'll start, clogging up tissues and circulatory systems and blocking the ability of normal organs and tissues to function properly. So on the toxin side of things, there's sort of these two categories of toxins that bacteria could produce: endo or exotoxins. Endo meaning inside. These would be toxins that are normally just contained inside of the bacteria. So these endotoxins would rarely be fatal, but there have been cases where somebody may have an infection from a bacteria that produces a nasty endotoxin, and then if that person is treated with an antibiotic that causes the bacteria to die and lyse open too quickly, basically you all of a sudden get this big dose of endotoxins from the bacteria breaking open, and the person could actually get sicker or die due to the antibiotic treatment. But generally speaking, endotoxins are less of a risk to human health, whereas exotoxins, because exo means outside, they're being secreted from the bacteria, are usually much more toxic. One well-known example of an exotoxin is from the bacteria that causes tetanus, right? Clostridium tetani. And this is a bacteria that likes to live just inside puncture wounds. So it's not a very invasive bacteria. It just hangs out in that one wound site, grows and reproduces there. But as it sits there, it's producing this exotoxin that gets into your bloodstream, and it can cause muscle paralysis. So you may have heard tetanus referred to as lockjaw. So if you have an untreated tetanus infection, that exotoxin will gradually make its way through your body, causing muscle paralysis, and it can in fact cause your jaw muscles to paralyze and lock up, hence that name. All right, so that's all I've got for you in terms of bacteria, but I do have just a few slides here at the end to talk about viruses, and again, with all the current COVID-19 insanity that's going on right now, I think this is very timely. So I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, viruses don't really fit very well into the biological picture because they're not living organisms. They're sort of in a gray area because they can do some things that living organisms can do. They can reproduce, but they can only do that inside of a living cell. So they are sort of cellular parasites in that sense. They do have genomes like we would see in living organisms. They can, populations of viruses can replicate, they can evolve, and there are definitely a lot of them. So we were talking about how abundant bacteria were. Well, viruses are even more abundant than bacteria, so they are literally everywhere. We don't really know a whole lot about the evolutionary history of viruses. We do know they've been around for a very, very long time. but their genomes are usually really, really small. Because they mutate very quickly, it makes it difficult to kind of establish, some of the evolutionary relationships using DNA or RNA sequences like we normally would. They don't really fossilize, so there's not any known viral fossils that would let us see what viruses used to look like. Um, but as I said, we do know they've been around for a long, long time. Um, so viruses have typically a very simple structure. So they have a genome that could be either DNA or RNA, and it could be single or double-stranded. So for example, the COVID-19 virus has a single-stranded RNA genome. So it's just one strand of RNA. So they've got that genome, and then they usually have a protein coat kind of surrounding or protecting that genome that's called the capsid. And the capsid is made from these just repetitive protein subunits called capsomeres, or sometimes you'll just see it called the capsid protein. But the capsid itself can have pretty diverse structures. So here's just a few examples. So we've got tobacco mosaic virus, adenovirus, influenza, and then bacteriophage T4. And you'll see I'm gonna talk about influenza separately because there's something a little bit different going on here. But the other three are basically just variations on the same theme. So we have the viral genome, whatever that happens to be. For tobacco mosaic virus, it's an RNA molecule. For adenovirus, it's DNA. But you have that that viral genome surrounded by and protected by the capsomere, or the capsid protein. Right. With tobacco mosaic virus, that happens to be this rod-shaped capsid. In bacteriophage, we get this kind of unusual structure. I always think it looks like the 1960s, like lunar landers that landed on the moon. But at any rate, there's a lot of diversity there in terms of the shape these can take on. And I mentioned influenza virus being a little bit different. So this one has that same basic structure. The influenza virus actually has multiple copies of RNA genome protected by capsid proteins. But then what's different here is this is all surrounded by a membrane, or the viral envelope, they'll call it. And that envelope is basically membrane that was picked up from the host cell as it entered. So you can kind of think of this as like a wolf in sheep's clothing kind of scenario, where it's hiding itself inside of a host membrane. And then you'll notice there's like these glycoproteins all over the surface. These would be important for attachment. You see those on the adenovirus as well. Okay, so why do viruses make us sick? Well, basically the sole goal of a virus is to get inside of a host cell, and then it's going to hijack that cell and use it as a factory to make more copies of the virus, right? So usually the damage is being done just because as we produce these new viruses inside the host cell, the host cell can no longer carry out its own functions properly, and in fact, as the viruses exit that host cell, they may very often kill the cell in the process. So you get lots of cells being either damaged or destroyed during this infection. There are some viruses that will have maybe envelope proteins that might be toxic, but that's pretty rare. So for example, taking this back to COVID-19 again, what seems to be causing the primary issue for people with that particular virus is as the virus gets into your respiratory tract and is moving through your lungs, like cell to cell, right, hijacking all these cells in your lungs, it is damaging and killing those cells. That's not allowing people to exchange oxygen properly, and that tissue damage will cause fluid buildup in the lungs, which will then provide a place for bacteria to grow. So you get bacterial pneumonia that can often be lethal. And while we're talking about COVID-19, um, I wanted to mention this term that's called emerging viruses. And so these are really viruses that are new to science or medicine. They've suddenly emerged. And where are they emerging from? Well, as we've seen with the coronavirus, right? A lot of times these are viruses that may have existed for a very long time in animal communities. So all the evidence suggests that COVID-19 made this jump from animals to humans in China, right? So, that particular virus may have been around for hundreds or thousands of years in animals, slowly mutating. But once it made that jump to humans, it is now proving to be very adept at being transmitted directly from human to human as well. And we're all too familiar with these terms at the moment, epidemic versus pandemic, right? So an epidemic would basically just be a local outbreak of disease, whereas a pandemic is essentially a global epidemic, which is obviously what we're seeing right now with COVID-19. Um, and traditionally, I've always talked about the 1918 flu pandemic as sort of the hallmark example. And you may or may not be familiar with this, but this was sometimes called the Spanish influenza. But this is another virus that emerged very suddenly. I think it came from pig populations, and this may have even happened in Kansas initially. So very similar to some current swine flus that are known to circulate. But the scale of this pandemic was really staggering. So they estimate at least 500 million people globally were infected within basically a year and a half span. And, just as we're seeing now, this was overwhelming hospitals to the point where you're just having to create, makeshift, basically hospital bays wherever, gymnasiums or warehouses, wherever you could stash people and try to isolate them. It was being done. Um, and just an incredible number of people died. So they estimate 50 to 100 million people around the world, giving this virus about a 5 to 10% mortality rate. Um, and this is somewhere in line with what we seem to be seeing in a lot of places with the worst of the COVID-19. There are places that have kept mortality rates lower, but in some of the harder hit areas, we're seeing a mortality rate in this range. And it's worth pointing out with the 1918 influenza, that was pre-antibiotic era. So a lot of the deaths that were occurring would have been due to bacterial pneumonia that developed in conjunction with the flu. And because there were no antibiotics, we really couldn't effectively treat those pneumonias. Um, so that was definitely increasing that mortality rate compared to what it might have been if that particular flu was around today. Um, so in terms of other potential emerging viruses of concern, obviously COVID-19 is what's on everybody's mind these days. But I almost hate to say it, but there are some much scarier potential viruses out there. Um, so, for example, I think really some of the scariest are these bird flus that we know about. So, for example, this one called H5N1. Right now, this is a influenza that only infects birds, and it can be transmitted to humans, but you would have to be in close direct contact with those birds. So this virus does not currently have the ability to be transmitted person to person. But I'm saying this is particularly scary because out of those people that have been infected with this particular bird flu, due to that close contact, the mortality rates are staggering, more than 50%. So, the kind of the great fear is that you would see one of these viruses mutate so that it develops the ability to spread easily human to human, which would obviously be pretty devastating. So, I'm hopeful that the current COVID-19 pandemic is making us more aware of how at risk we are to some of these emerging viruses. And I know there are scientists that are certainly keeping their eye on these bird flus, and in fact, in parts of Asia where this is more of a problem, they're actually vaccinating birds. Um, so there are some steps being taken, but I think as we're seeing in the current climate, right, there's definitely more that we could do to protect ourselves and to try to ensure that we're not seeing these viruses make that jump to humans. So anyway, on that scary note, I will end it, and I really appreciate you being along for the ride this semester, and take care.